Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It is such an honor to be here. I'm so thrilled to be with you here tonight. I'm really excited to be in this space. I'm really energized by Dr. Keller's sermon and the way he has set a context for the conversation I want to have tonight. I want to talk about what does it require for us to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. That's a scripture. And Prophet Micah talks about, what do we have to do to be pleasing to God? And should we offer all of these great things? We have to do these big and extraordinary things. And what the prophet says is, no, you just have to do justice, you have to love mercy, and you have to walk humbly with God. And in many ways, this need to do justice, this need to change the world, is something that I feel really keenly. And so I want to talk tonight about what I think we need to do to change the world. And by changing the world, do justice and love mercy. There's a real need for it. We're a very different country today than we were 50 years ago. In 1972, there were 300,000 people in jails and prisons in America. Today, there are 2.3 million people in jails and prisons. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We have 6 million people on probation or parole. There are 70 million Americans with criminal arrests, which means that when they try to get a job or try to get a loan, they're disfavored. We've done some terrible things to women in our society. The percentage of women going to prison has increased 640% over the last 20 years, and 70% of these women are single parents with minor children, which means that when they go to jails or prisons, their children are displaced. There are these collateral consequences. Last year, the president came to Selma, Alabama, to my state of Alabama, and he came to Selma to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act and that historic march from Selma to Montgomery. And members of Congress came and thousands of people came and they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge to celebrate that historic march. And very few of them realized that today in Alabama, 30% of the black male population has permanently lost the right to vote as a result of a criminal conviction. Half the people we have in jails and prisons suffer from mental illness. 20% are acutely mentally ill. The statistic that keeps me up late at night is one from the Bureau of Justice. The Bureau of Justice now predicts that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison during his lifetime. 1 in 3. That wasn't true in the 19th century. It wasn't true in the 20th century. It's become true in the 21st century. The statistic for Latino boys is 1 in 6. So I think there's this urgent need for us to change the world. There is this urgent need to do justice. And I could talk about the problems all night, but I didn't come to talk about the problems. I want to talk about the solutions. I want to talk about what I think we can do to create more justice. The first thing I am persuaded we have to do is I am persuaded that if you want to do justice, if you want to love mercy, you've got to get proximate to the places and the people where injustice is made known. You cannot stay in safe places. You cannot stay in comfortable places. I believe we are called to get proximate to the places in our community where there's poverty and suffering and abuse and neglect. Many of us have been taught our whole lives that if there are parts of our town, our community, where the schools aren't very good, where there's violence, where there's drug addiction, where there's despair, where there's neglect or abuse, you should stay as far away from those places as possible. I'm here tonight to tell you the opposite. I actually think to do justice, you've got to get closer to the schools where kids are struggling. You've got to get closer to the parts of our community where there's poverty and abuse and violence and neglect and despair. And in proximity, I am persuaded we can find power. I think there's power in proximity. You don't have to have all the answers and the solutions, but you've got to be willing to get closer to the places where there's inequality. We've got policymakers and politicians trying to solve problems from a distance. And when you try to solve problems from a distance, your solutions don't work because you miss the details of the problems, the nuances of the problems. I believe you've got to get proximate. I'm the product of someone's choice to get proximate. I grew up in the rural South in a community where black children couldn't go to the public schools. I started my education in a colored school. When I was a little boy, we couldn't go to the public school. In my county, there were no high schools for black children when my dad was a teenager. And then one day, the lawyers came into our community, and they insisted that that county respond to Brown versus Board of Education. They made them open up the public schools, and because of that, I got to go to high school. And I am not confused about how I got here. I got here because people were willing to get proximate to poor black kids like me. And I got to go to high school. I graduated from high school, and I got to go to college. Went to Eastern University in Pennsylvania. Great school, yes, thank you. Beautiful campus. When I got to college, I'd never seen a world like that. I was very active in music. I was very active in sports. I was a philosophy major. And about my second year in college, I woke up one morning and I realized something. I realized I really like college. And I made a decision. I decided that I was going to spend the rest of my life in college. And I called my mom up, said, Mom, I've made a decision. I've decided to spend the rest of my life in college. My mom said, I didn't go to college, but I don't think they're going to let you do that. I said, Mom, they will. And I was a senior, still majoring in philosophy. And because I was a philosophy major, I thought I was supposed to go out on the hillside and think these deep thoughts. And I was out there one day thinking my so-called deep thoughts, and somebody came up to me and said, you are a senior, and you are a philosophy major. What are you going to do when you graduate from college? And I heard this as a very hostile question, because I realized nobody was going to pay me to philosophize, and so I frantically started trying to figure out, how do I stay in school? And because nobody in my family had gone to school, I didn't know what everybody in this room, I'm sure, already knows. I didn't know that in this country, if you want to do graduate work in history or English or political science, to get admitted to graduate school, you actually have to know something about history, English, or political science. That was pretty intimidating to me, so I kept looking, and to be honest, that's how I found law school. It was very clear to me, you don't need to know anything to go to law school. So I signed up for that, and a few months later, I found myself sitting in a classroom at Harvard Law School, and I was deeply disillusioned because they weren't talking about the things that motivated. I went to law school because I was concerned about racial inequality, I was concerned about poverty, I was concerned about social injustice, and it didn't seem like anybody was talking about race or poverty or injustice. I left the law school after my first year to go to the School of Government at Harvard. I decided to pursue a degree in public policy. And I woke up after I'd been there a couple of months one day, and I was looking in the mirror, and I thought to myself, wow, I'm even more miserable here than I was at the law school. They were teaching us to maximize benefits and minimize costs, but it didn't seem to matter whose benefits got maximized and whose costs got minimized. I went back to the law school, and then I was about to do this thing I pray none of you ever do. I was about to do this thing where I was trying to persuade myself to accept a career as a lawyer that I knew was not going to be affirming, that I knew was not going to be energizing, that I knew was not what I was called to. And then I got proximate. I took a course that required me to spend time with a human rights organization in Georgia, and I went down and I met these lawyers providing legal services to people on death row. And there was a community of people there, and I was energized by what I saw. And I'd been there a week, and one of the lawyers said, we need you to go to death row and meet someone we haven't had time to meet. We just need you to go down and explain to him that he's not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. I drove down there the next day, and I was very nervous because I was persuaded that this man wouldn't want to just see a law student. I tried to rehearse exactly what I was going to say, and I went into the prison. They took me to the cell, and I was pacing back and forth, really nervous, really anxious, and finally they opened the door, and there stood the first condemned prisoner I'd ever seen. And what struck me about him was how burdened with chains he was. He had handcuffs on his wrists, he had a chain around his waist, he had shackles on his ankles, and I stood there while they unchained him, and I got so nervous that by the time he walked inside, I'd forgotten what I was supposed to say, and I just said, I'm so sorry, I'm just a law student. I don't know anything about the death penalty. I don't know anything about civil procedure. I don't know anything about criminal procedure. I don't know anything about appellate procedure. Oh, but they sent me down here to tell you that you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And as soon as I said that, the man said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And the man said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And that's when this man grabbed my hands. He said, thank you. He said, you're the first person I've met who's not a death row prisoner or a death row guard in the 2 years I've been on death row. He said, I've been talking to my wife and my kids at night, but I haven't let them come and visit because I was afraid I'd have an execution date, and I didn't want them to have to deal with that. He said, now because of you, I'm going to see my wife, I'm going to see my kids. Thank you. And I couldn't believe how even in my ignorance, how just being proximate could be transformative in the life of someone else. But all of a sudden it kicked in and we started talking, this man and me, and it turned out we were exactly the same age. We had the same birthday, same month, same day, same year. He started asking me questions about my life. I asked him questions about his life, and we fell into this conversation. And 1 hour turned into 2 hours, and 2 hours turned into 3 hours. I'd only scheduled to be there an hour, and the guards were getting angry, waiting outside the room. And finally, after 3 hours, they couldn't take it any longer, so they came bursting into the room, and they were frustrated. And they couldn't do anything to me, so they took it out on this man. They threw him against the wall. And they began putting the chains on him very roughly. I tried to get them to be gentler, but they ignored me. And they put the handcuffs on his wrists so tightly I could see him grimacing with pain. They wrapped the chain around his waist so tightly. I said, please, it's not his fault, it's my fault. Don't take it out on him, but they ignored me. And then they put the shackles on his ankles so tight you could see him struggling. And I was really stressed by this. And this condemned man looked at me and he said, Bryan, don't worry about this. You just come back. And then they started shoving this man toward the door. He almost fell down. He kept his balance and they kept pushing him so roughly, and they got him in front of the door. And then I watched this man do something. He planted his feet, and the next time when they shoved him, he didn't move. And then this man turned to me and he looked at me and he said, Bryan, don't worry about this. You just come back. And then that man did something I've never forgotten. I stood there and I watched him close his eyes, throw his head back, and then he started to sing. And he started singing this hymn. He started singing, I'm pressing on the upward way. New heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound. And then he said, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Everybody stopped. The guards recovered. They started pushing him down the hallway. You could hear the chains clanging, but you could hear this man singing about higher ground. And I will tell you, hearing that man's song changed me. All of a sudden, I knew I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. But more than that, I knew that my journey to higher ground was tied to his journey. I realized that if he doesn't get there, I can't get there. And in an instant, my interest in law was radicalized. I went back to Harvard Law School. You couldn't get me out of the law school library. I needed to know everything about substantive due process and procedural due process and civil procedure and appellate procedure. I needed to know it all because now I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. I tell you that because there's power in proximity. You don't have to have all the solutions when you go into poor neighborhoods. You don't have to have solutions when you go into jails and prisons. You don't have to know everything there is to know when you're working with the formerly incarcerated. You don't have to know how to deal with all the nuances of drug addiction and despair and violence, but I urge you to recognize that if you choose to get proximate, you will find a power that allows you to do justice. There is power in proximity. Second thing, I don't think we can do what we're trying to do. We can't change the world. We can't do justice by just getting proximate. The second thing I'm persuaded we have to do is that we've got to change narratives. You see, the problems that we're talking about in this country and across the world are the results of policy decisions and political things, but underneath those problems, there are narratives. And we've got to change some of those narratives. We have mass incarceration in this country. We have excessive punishment because we chose to deal with drug addiction and drug dependency as a crime issue instead of a health issue. We could have said that drug addiction and drug dependency, that's a health problem. And let's use our health infrastructure to address that problem. We did that for alcoholism. We don't regard alcoholism as a crime. We regard that as a disease. We used a health model. And if we know someone who's alcoholic and we see them going into a bar, we don't think, oh, let's call the police. We think, let's try to intervene. But for drug addiction and drug dependency, we said they're criminals. And we've put hundreds of thousands of people in jails and prisons. It is the primary reason we have these huge race disparities. But there was a narrative that caused us to see that as a crime rather than a health crisis. And that narrative was rooted in what I call the politics of fear and anger. Our politicians have been preaching to us, be afraid and be angry for decades. And I will tell you that when you make decisions rooted in fear and anger, you will tolerate oppression. You will tolerate inequality. You will tolerate injustice. And I believe we are called to reject fear and anger. And we've got to change that narrative. I've seen it happen to children. My clients have gotten younger and younger and younger. There were some people going around the country 30 years ago arguing that some children aren't children. They began to argue that there are some kids in our society that may look like kids and may talk like kids, but they said these aren't really kids. They said these are super predators. And they used this word to demonize a generation of children, mostly black and brown kids. And every state in the country lowered the minimum age for trying children as adults. You did it here in the state of New York. There's a campaign going on right now to raise the age in response to this hysteria created by this super predator myth. And today we have thousands of kids serving decades of adult incarceration. I've represented 9 and 10-year-old children facing decades of imprisonment. We have 13 and 14-year-old children in this country who have been condemned to die in prison with life imprisonment without parole sentences. And there's a narrative that created this hysteria, and we've got to change the narrative. A few years ago, I was working on a case involving a 14-year-old boy who lived in a household where his mother was repeatedly the target of a lot of domestic violence. This boy's mother had a boyfriend. And when this man would come home, he would sometimes get violent if he'd been drinking. And one day he'd been drinking, and he came into the house. He didn't say anything. He just called the boy's mother into the kitchen. And he walked up to her, and he punched her in the face. She fell. She hit her head as she fell, and she was on the floor bleeding and unconscious. Her son came running into the kitchen to try to help his mom. He tried to stop the bleeding. He tried to get her to wake up. But no matter what he did, she wouldn't respond. And after 10 minutes, this child thought his mom was dead. She wasn't dead, but he thought his mom was dead. The little boy got up and he walked into the bedroom where the man had fallen asleep. And he walked over to the dresser drawer where he knew this man kept his handgun. And this little boy grabbed that gun and he walked over to where the man was sleeping and he pointed the gun at the man's head. The man was snoring. And when the man stopped snoring, this little boy panicked and tragically pulled the trigger and shot this man in the head. The man was killed almost instantly. This little boy was very small for his age. He was under 5 feet tall. He weighed less than 100 pounds. He'd never been in trouble before. He was the kind of kid that might have been tried as a juvenile, but for the fact that the man that he shot and killed, his mother's boyfriend, well, that man was a deputy sheriff. And because he was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this child be tried as an adult. And the judge certified him to stand trial as an adult, and they immediately placed him in the adult jail. He'd been there 3 days before his grandmother got me involved in the case. I went to the jail to meet this little boy. He walked in, this little tiny kid, terrified. And he sat down, and I started asking him questions, but no matter what I asked him, he wouldn't say anything. He just sat there. And I finally put my pen down. I said, look, I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You got to talk to me. The little boy wouldn't say anything. He just kept staring at the wall. I got up, and I walked around the table. I pulled my chair close to him. I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. And the little boy wouldn't say anything. He just kept staring. Couldn't figure out what to do. I sat there, and I just couldn't figure out what to do. And at some point, I just leaned on him. I don't even know why, but I leaned on him. And when I leaned on him, he leaned back. And when he leaned back, I put my arm around him, and I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. And that's when this little boy started to cry. And through his tears, he began talking to me, not about what happened with the man, not about what happened with his mom, but he started talking to me about what had happened at the jail. He told me on the first night several men had hurt him. He told me on the next night he'd been raped by several people. He told me on the night before I'd gotten there, so many people had hurt him, he couldn't remember how many there had been. And then this little boy cried hysterically for almost an hour. I finally got him calm, and I said, look, I'm going to get you out of here. You stay right here. I'm going to get you out of here. And I never will forget trying to leave that jail and that little boy grabbing my arm saying, please, please, please don't go. I said, no, it's okay. It's all right. I'm going to get you out of here. You stay right here. And I left that jail, and the question I had in my mind when I left that jail is, who is responsible for this? And the answer is, we are. We are. We've allowed a narrative to emerge in this country that some children aren't children. We've allowed this distance to be created from the most vulnerable children in our society, and we have thrown away the abused children. We have thrown away the vulnerable children. We've thrown away the kids that are struggling with trauma and neglect. We have thrown away the kids that join these gangs, and I'm here to tell you that if we want to do justice, we've got to change the narrative. I believe God calls us to recognize that all children are children. We are all God's children, and we cannot throw away any member of this community. We've got to understand that doing justice means claiming the children that other people throw away. It means claiming those who are rejected by others. We've got to change the narrative. I actually think we have to change the narrative about race in America. You see, I don't think we're free in this country. I don't. I think we're burdened by our history of racial inequality. We live in a space with pollution created by our history of inequality. There's like a smog all around us, and we've been breathing it in. We don't even talk about it. And we are not free. It doesn't take very much to create tension and distrust, and we will not get free until we change the narrative. There are things we have to talk about that we haven't talked about. We are a post-genocidal society in this country. There was a genocide here. Before white settlers came, there were native people on this continent, millions of indigenous Native Americans, and they were slaughtered by the millions. by famine and disease and war, and we haven't talked about the things you're supposed to talk about to recover from a genocide, and that genocide made us tolerant of this idea that we can victimize some people if they're different. And that narrative of racial difference is what gave rise to centuries of slavery. And the legacy of slavery is like a shadow all over this country. And I don't think the great evil of American slavery was involuntary servitude or forced labor. I believe the great evil of American slavery was the narrative of racial difference that we created to legitimate it. The great evil of American slavery was the ideology of white supremacy that we made up to justify enslaving other people. We said that these black people are different. They've got these deficits and these qualities and these attributes, and we can enslave them because they are different. And that narrative of racial difference, that was the great evil of American slavery. And if I read the 13th Amendment, it doesn't talk about the ideology of white supremacy. It doesn't talk about narratives of racial difference. It only talks about involuntary servitude and forced labor. And that's why I believe that slavery didn't end in 1865. It just evolved. It turned into decades of terrorism and lynching and violence. We suffered through terrorism in this country. We pulled black people out of their homes, and we hanged them, and we mutilated them, and we burned them alive, and we created this era of terror. And older people of color understand it. They come up to me sometimes and say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear someone on TV talking about how we're dealing with domestic terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They say we grew up with terrorism. We had to worry about being bombed and lynched and menaced every day of our lives. They'll sometimes say, Mr. Stevenson, you make them stop saying that, because it's a source of provocation. And they're right. Now, this country, the demographics of this country was shaped by racial terror. Many of the black people, the black Americans that are in New York City, the black people in Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles and Oakland and Boston and Minneapolis did not go to those communities as immigrants seeking new economic opportunities. They came to these communities as refugees and exiles from terrorism in the American South. And we haven't done the things you're supposed to do to help a refugee community recover. And that challenge still hangs over us. And then we get into the civil rights movement. And I'm going to get in trouble here for real. I'm just going to warn you. Because I think we're too celebratory when we talk about civil rights in this country. I mean, it's appropriate that we talk about civil rights, but I don't think that we're doing it the right way. We're too celebratory. I hear people talking about the civil rights movement, and it sounds like a 3-day carnival. On day 1, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on a bus. On day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington. And on day 3, we changed all the laws and racism was over. And it would be great if that's our history, but that's not our history. Our history is that for decades in this country, we beat and burdened and excluded people of color. We did terrible things. We told black people, you're not good enough to vote just because you're black. We said to people of color, you can't go to school with the rest of us because you're a person of color. My parents were humiliated every day of their lives. Every time they saw those signs that said white and colored, they weren't directions, they were assaults. And we haven't done the things you're supposed to do to help someone recover from assault. We should have committed to a process of truth and reconciliation in the 1960s, but we didn't do it. And now there is a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that follows black and brown people in this country. It is a burden that they have to carry. We have to carry. And it weighs on us, and it becomes exhausting. And there is this need to change the narrative. And I have to tell people of color, my students of color, I said, it doesn't matter how many good grades you get. It doesn't matter how many degrees you get. It may not even matter how much wealth you accumulate. There will still be times and places where you're presumed dangerous and guilty. I was in a courtroom not too long ago, getting ready for a hearing. I was sitting at defense counsel's table. I had my suit and tie on. I was there early, first time in this courtroom. And the judge walked in, and he saw me sitting there, and he said, hey. You get back out there in the hallway and you wait until your lawyer gets here. I don't want any defendant sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And I stood up, I said, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Bryan Stevenson, I am the lawyer. And the judge started laughing, and the prosecutor started laughing, and I made myself laugh because I didn't want to disadvantage my client. Client came in, a young white kid I was representing. We did the hearing, but later I was thinking, what is it that when this judge saw a middle-aged black man sitting in a suit and tie at defense counsel's table, it didn't even occur to him that that's the lawyer. What that is this narrative of racial difference, and we've got to change the narrative. In South Africa, there was a recognition that they could not recover from apartheid without truth and reconciliation. In Rwanda, they will tell you that they cannot recover from the genocide without truth and reconciliation. Go to Germany. If you go to Berlin, Germany, you can't go 100 meters without finding a marker or a stone that's been placed next to the home of a Jewish family that was abducted during the Holocaust. The Germans want you to go to Auschwitz and Birkenau and reflect soberly on the legacy of the Holocaust. In this country, we do the opposite. We don't talk about slavery. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about segregation. You start talking about race and people get nervous. You start talking about racial justice and we're looking for exits, and we cannot do justice. We cannot change the world until we change this narrative of racial difference. I am committed to a project. We are putting markers at every lynching site in America. I want to mark the spaces in New York City where the slave trade was active. I want to mark the spaces in this country where we should be reminded of this burden that we have got to lift if we want to create more justice. But it's not enough to change the narrative. The third thing I'm persuaded we have to do is that I am persuaded that we've got to stay hopeful. And for people of faith, let me just say this. A lot of times it seems odd that somebody would come in a faith setting and talk about the need to be hopeful, but I really do believe that for a lot of us, it is easier to be faithful than to be hopeful. And sometimes we get locked into the habits of faith. At the same time, we are hopeless about what we can do. And I am here to say that you've got to be hopeful. You cannot do justice. You cannot love mercy unless you are hopeful about what you can do in the world. Hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. And if you are not hopeful, you are part of the problem. You cannot represent God in his glory. You cannot be that witness. Your power resonates in your hopefulness. Hope is what will get you to stand up when other people say sit down. Hope is what will get you to speak when other people say be quiet. You've got to be hopeful. And you got to figure out the things that threaten your hopelessness, your hopefulness. And you've got to protect yourself from them. I can't tell you what makes you hopeless. I'll tell you a little bit about what makes me hopeless. I live in Montgomery, Alabama. It's probably the worst place in America for me to be living. Because to be honest, the thing that challenges my hope dynamic is I really do not like it when people start talking about the good old days of the 40s and the 50s. I don't like it when we try to romanticize our history. I don't like it when people talk about make America great again. I don't like it when we start framing things in this historical way. In my state of Alabama, Confederate Memorial Day is a state holiday. In Alabama, Jefferson Davis's birthday is a state holiday. In Alabama, we don't even have Martin Luther King Day. It's Martin Luther King / Robert E. Lee Day. Our two largest high schools are Robert E. Lee High and Jefferson Davis High, and I will tell you that it challenges me when we do that kind of thinking, and I have to position myself in a more hopeful way. I've got to make sure I am standing and interacting with people who I know are rooted in these narratives in a hopeful way. I want to be really clear about something. I am talking about racial justice in this country. I want to confront these problems, not because I'm interested in punishment. Part of the reason why we don't like talking about our history of racial inequality is that we're such a punitive society. We're afraid that if we own up to these problems, there's going to be some vast, great punishment. And as people of faith, we've got to stand up and say, no, there's actually this path toward redemption only when we acknowledge our sins. We can't cheat. There's something better on the other side of acknowledgement than punishment, and that's called liberation. And the reason why I want to kind of live hopefully, I want to grasp the hands of those people who are saying some really hateful things and say, I have this hope that we can do better than create these divisions, is because hope is necessary. I had the great privilege when I was a young lawyer of meeting Rosa Parks. She was an amazing person. And when I moved to Montgomery, there was an older woman by the name of Johnny Carr, who was the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott. And she called me up and she said, Bryan, I understand you're a young lawyer, just moved to Montgomery. I said, yes, I am. She said, well, I'm the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott. And I said, well, it's so nice to meet you. She said, well, now because you're a lawyer, I'm going to call you up sometimes and I'm going to ask you to go some places and talk. And then she said, sometimes I'm going to ask you to go some places and listen. And she said, when I call you up and ask you to do something, you're going to say, yes, ma'am. I said, yes, ma'am. And she would call me up and send me places. And one day she called me and she said, Bryan, Rosa Parks is coming to town. And we're going to get together at Virginia Durr's house, a white woman whose husband, Clifford Durr, represented Dr. King. And we're just going to talk. She said, do you want to come over and listen? I said, yes, Miss Carr, I really do. And every now and then she'd say, Bryan, what does the word listen mean? And I'd have to explain to her that I knew I wasn't supposed to talk. And I went over there and I met Ms. Parks and I sat next to her, and they were in their 70s and 80s. And the amazing thing was that they weren't talking about what they had done. They were talking about what they were going to do. There was a hopefulness that they had all inside of them. And I just sat there so inspired for 2 hours. And after a couple of hours, Ms. Parks turned to me and she said, "Now, Bryan, tell me what the Equal Justice Initiative is. Tell me what you're trying to do." And I looked at Ms. Carr to see if I had permission to speak, and she nodded. And I turned to Ms. Parks and I gave her my whole rap. I said, "We're trying to do something about the death penalty. We're trying to do something about excessive punishment. We're trying to do something about racial inequality. We're trying to do something to help the poor. We're trying to do something about children prosecuted as adults. We're trying to do something to help people who are mentally ill. We're trying to do something about these conditions of confinement." I gave her my whole rap. And when I finished, she looked at me and she said, She said, "That's going to make you tired, tired, tired." And that's when Ms. Carr leaned forward and she put her finger in my face. She said, "That's why you got to be brave, brave, brave. It takes courage to be hopeful. But when we are hopeful, we find the strength to do the things that allow us to change the world." Fourth and finally, I don't think we can do justice. I don't think we can love mercy. I don't think we can change the world by just being proximate, just changing narratives, just being hopeful. The fourth thing we have to do, and this is a hard one, is I am persuaded that we've got to be willing to do uncomfortable things. There is no path forward until we are willing to do uncomfortable things. I've looked for examples where oppression was overcome, where inequality was overcome, where justice prevailed, where nobody had to do anything uncomfortable. And I can't find any examples of that. In order for us to make progress, we're going to have to be willing to position ourselves in uncomfortable places, and it's hard. Because we're human, and humans are programmed to seek comfort. We like comfort. I like comfort. I'm not preaching against comfort. I gave a talk down in Mississippi. The people met me at the airport, and they came up to me and said, "Oh, Mr. Stevenson, we know all about you. We've read your book. We know what kind of lawyer you are. We know what kind of work you do. And we have to tell you that we're having our conference at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. And we decided that you wouldn't want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. So we've asked one of the farmers to put you up at the barn." I said, "What is wrong with you?" I said, "Of course I want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. I like those chocolate chip cookies just like everybody else." That's not what I'm talking about is that sometimes you have to position yourself in uncomfortable places, and you've got to be a witness. I represent people on death row. We've had some wonderful moments. We've had some great victories, but we've also had some difficult, dark days. A few years ago, we had just a kind of a whole lot of executions. Every other month, somebody was facing execution, and there is no right to counsel for people on death row in this country. One of the challenges that we have in America is that we've got a criminal justice system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. Wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes. And this man was facing execution, and my young lawyers were getting so beat down, I said, "You know what, you all take a break. I've been doing this longer. I'll take the next case." And I quickly learned that this man who was scheduled to be executed in 30 days suffered from intellectual disability. He was mentally retarded, and we've got a court decision that says you cannot execute people with intellectual disability. So I went to the court and said, "This man suffers from this disability. You cannot execute him." But the court said, "Too late." I said, "No, it's not too late. We haven't executed him. We can stop this." But the court said too late, and the appeals court said too late, and the state court said too late, and the federal court said too late, and finally, it was the day of the execution, and I still had not been able to get a stay, and I was waiting to hear from the United States Supreme Court what they would do. And about an hour before the execution, when I was getting more frantic and pacing in my office, the phone rang, and I picked up the phone, and it was the clerk of court. And the clerk told me that our stay motion asking for a stay of execution had been distributed to the court and considered by the judges. And then she said, "I want you to know that your motion has been adjudicated and the court has decided to deny your motion for a stay." I was devastated. I picked up the phone to call this man on the row, and I gave him this heartbreaking news, and he began to cry. And then he began to sob. And in the midst of his tears, he said to me, he said, "Mr. Stevenson, there's something I really have to say to you before you hang up. Please let me say what I have to say." And then this man tried to say something to me, but in addition to having an intellectual disability, he had another challenge. He also, when he got really nervous, when he got anxious, he had a very severe speech impediment. And he would begin to stutter terribly when he was really overwhelmed. And after telling me that he had something really important to say to me, he tried to say what he had to say, but he couldn't get his words out. He started to stutter very, very badly. He kept trying to talk. He kept trying to talk, but he couldn't get a single word out. And the harder this man tried to talk, the more he was ripping my heart apart. I was standing there, holding the phone, and tears were running down my face, and he kept trying, and he kept trying. I could hear the guards trying to rush him, which just made it worse. And he kept trying, and all of a sudden, I just realized that this was so painful, painfully uncomfortable. And my mind drifted a little bit, and I remembered how when I was about 9 or 10, my mother took me to church one Sunday, and I was with my brother, talking to my friends, and I remembered how on that Sunday morning there was a little skinny kid I'd never seen before at church. And this little boy wasn't saying anything, and I remembered how I asked that little boy a question. And the little boy tried to answer my question, but I remembered how he also had a very severe speech impediment. And when he tried to answer my question, he couldn't get his words out either. He stuttered terribly. And then I remembered that I did something really shameful. I did something really ignorant. I remembered that I laughed at that little boy. And my mother saw me laughing at this child, and she gave me this look I'd never seen before. And she came over and grabbed me by the arm, and she pulled me aside, and she said to me, she said, "Bryan, don't you ever laugh at somebody because they can't get their words out right. Don't you ever do that." And even at 9, I was a little lawyer. I said, "Well, Mom, I didn't know. I didn't think. I didn't know." And she said, no, you know better than that." And then my mother looked at me. She said, "Now you go back over there and tell that little boy you're sorry." I said, "Okay, Mom." And I took a step, and then my mom grabbed me by the arm. She said, "Wait, after you tell that little boy you're sorry, I want you to hug that little boy." Kind of rolled my eyes, but I said, "Okay, Mom." And I took a step, and then she grabbed me by the arm again. She said, "Wait, after you hug that little boy, I want you to tell that little boy you love him." I said, "Mom, I can't go over there and do that." And she gave me that look again, so I said, okay. And on the night of this execution, I remembered going over to this little boy and walking up to him and saying, "Look, man, I'm sorry." And then I remembered sort of lunging at him and giving him my little boy version of a man hug. And then I remembered trying to say to that child as insincerely as I possibly could, I said, "Look, I don't know, well, yeah, I love you." And what I'd forgotten was how that little boy hugged me back and then whispered flawlessly in my ear, he said, "I love you too." And I was thinking about that while this man was trying to get his words out. And finally, the man got his words out. And what he said to me was, "Mr. Stevenson, I want to thank you for fighting for me." He said, "I want to thank you for representing me." And the last thing that man said was, "Mr. Stevenson, I love you for trying to save my life." He hung up the phone. They pulled him away. They strapped him to a gurney, and they executed him. I hung up the phone, and I put it down. I said, "I can't do this anymore. It's too hard, too hard, too hard, too hard." I was just devastated. I kept thinking about how broken he was. And the question I had in my mind is, why do we want to kill all the broken people? What is it about us in this country that when we see brokenness, we want to crush it, we want to throw it away, we want to step on it? Why do we want to kill all the broken people? And then I realized something. I realized that I represent the broken. All of my clients are broken people. They've been broken by poverty and disability and racism and neglect and all of these disorders in our society. And then I realized I work in a broken system. The people who have power are not willing to get proximate. They're not willing to get out of this narrative of fear and anger. They're not hopeful. They are unwilling to do uncomfortable things. And I said, I don't want to have anything more to do with this. And that's when I began to have that conversation where you think about when you're going to do something different. And all of a sudden, I remembered that scripture. Dr. Keller gave us these scriptures, but I remembered that scripture where Paul was writing to the church in Corinth about all his many burdens. And I remembered what the scripture says about God's grace being sufficient and that his power is made perfect in weakness. And all of a sudden, I heard that scripture in a way I'd never heard it before. And I thought about that scripture that says, when I am weak, then I am strong. And just like that, it became clear to me why I do what I do. And I realized something I'd never realized before. And what I realize is that I don't do what I do because it's about justice. I don't do what I do because I've been trained to do it. I don't do what I do because if I don't do it, no one will. I don't do what I do because it's important. I don't do what I do because somebody has to do it. I realized that night something I'd never realized before. And what I realize is that I do what I do because I'm broken too. And the truth is, if you get proximate, if you change narratives, if you stay hopeful, if you do uncomfortable things, it will break you. But the better truth, the glorious truth, that is that in brokenness we are filled with grace and mercy. There is this love that fills all of those broken spaces that strengthens us. It is in brokenness that we can find the pathway to mercy. It is in brokenness that we understand compassion. It is the broken that can teach us the way justice works. I am persuaded of some really simple things. I believe that we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. I think that for every human being. I think if someone tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if someone takes something, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill someone, you're not just a killer, and we are called to understand the other things people are before we judge. I am also persuaded that in this country, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. We talk too much about money in America. I believe that that the opposite of poverty isn't wealth. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. And when we commit to justice, that's how we change the world. And finally, I believe that when I come to New York City, when I come to Redeemer, when I come to settings like this, I'm so energized by the faithful and the hardworking and the motivated and those who are willing to do these things. But I have to tell you that we cannot judge our commitment to doing justice. We cannot judge our character, our commitment to the rule of law by looking at how we treat the rich and the powerful and the privileged. As Dr. Keller told us, we have to judge how we're doing as people of faith by looking at how we treat the poor, the incarcerated, and the condemned. There is a different metric system for those of us who want to change the world, for those of us who want to do justice. I'll end with this. I was giving a talk in a church, and an older man came into the back of the church. He was sitting in a wheelchair, older black man. And the whole time I was talking, he was staring at me with this very kind of harsh, almost stern look on his face. And I couldn't figure out why he was looking at me so hard. And I got through my talk. People came up. They were very nice and appropriate. But this older black man sitting in that wheelchair kept staring at me. And when everybody else left, he got a young kid to wheel him to the front of the church. And he came down that aisle of that church with this stern, almost angry look on his face. And when he got in front of me, he put his hand up and he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I just stood there. And then he asked me again, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I stepped back, I mumbled something. I don't even remember what I said. Then he asked me one more time. He said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And then he looked at me and he said, "I'm going to tell you what you're doing." And this older man looked at me and he said, "You're beating the drum for justice. You keep beating the drum for justice." And I was so moved. I was also really relieved because I just didn't know. Then he grabbed me by my jacket and he pulled me into his wheelchair. He said, "Come here, come here, come here. I'm going to show you something." And this older man turned his head. He said, "You see this cut I have here on the right ear, underneath my right ear?" He says, "I got that cut in Greene County, Alabama in 1963 trying to register people to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see this scar I have down here at the bottom of my neck?" He said, "I got that scar in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964 trying to register people to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see this dark spot?" He said, "That's my bruise. I got my bruise in Birmingham, Alabama in 1965 trying to register people to vote." He said, "I'm going to tell you something, young man." He said, "People look at me. They think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars." He said, "But I'm going to tell you something." He said, "These aren't my cuts. These aren't my bruises. These aren't my scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor." We honor the call to justice when we choose to get proximate, when we choose to change these narratives, when we stay hopeful, when we do uncomfortable things, we lift up something powerful, restorative, transformative. And I'm excited that you would invite me to Redeemer, that you would invite me to be a part of this conversation. And I am grateful to all of you for your choice tonight to get proximate, to change narratives, to be hopeful, and yes, to do uncomfortable things. I wish God's blessings on all of you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.